What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine interview, only to discover the host has a hidden agenda? It only took 35 seconds for Stephen Colbert to completely destroy his own reputation and career with a single disrespectful comment that would leave Denzel Washington absolutely furious and walking off set. The Late Show studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. Audience members chatted excitedly, cameras rolled into position, and the production crew made final adjustments. Tonight's guest was supposed to be the highlight of the week. Denzel Washington, the two-time Academy Award winner, was making a rare late-night appearance to discuss his latest directorial project. Stephen Colbert strutted onto the stage with his typical smug confidence, soaking in the applause from his loyal studio audience. He adjusted his tie, flashed his trademark grin, and settled behind his desk. Everything appeared normal, but behind those friendly eyes was something darker, something that would soon reveal itself in the most shocking way possible. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Denzel Washington. The audience erupted as Denzel walked out, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit. His presence commanded immediate respect. Every step he took radiated the dignity and grace that had made him one of the most beloved figures in entertainment. He waved to the crowd with genuine warmth, shook Colbert's hand firmly, and took his seat. "Denzel, thank you so much for being here," Colbert began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I have to say, I'm a huge fan of your work." "Thank you, Stephen. Happy to be here," Denzel replied with his characteristic calm demeanor. The interview started smoothly enough. Colbert asked about Denzel's latest film, his directing process, and his thoughts on the current state of Hollywood. Denzel answered each question thoughtfully, providing insights that only someone with his experience could offer. The audience hung on every word, but something was off. Colbert kept glancing at his cards with a strange expression. His questions became slightly more pointed, his tone shifting from respectful to subtly condescending. It was as if he was building up to something, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "You know, Denzel," Colbert said, leaning back in his chair with a knowing smirk, "I've been thinking about your career, and I have to ask you something that's been on my mind." Denzel raised an eyebrow slightly, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Go ahead." "Well, you've played a lot of tough guys, heroes, men of integrity," Colbert continued, his voice taking on a mocking edge that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably. "But I wonder, is that all just acting? I mean, do you ever feel like you're just playing the same character over and over again?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. It was insulting, reductive, and completely disrespectful to one of the greatest actors of his generation. Denzel's expression remained controlled, but those who knew him well could see the flash of anger in his eyes. "I think every role I take on brings something different," Denzel replied evenly, his voice steady but with an undertone of warning. "Each character has their own story, their own struggles, their own truth." Colbert laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was condescending, dismissive. "Come on, Denzel. You're telling me there's a big difference between your character in Training Day and your character in The Equalizer? They're both just angry black men with guns, right?" The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped what they were doing. The phrase "angry black men" echoed through the space like a slap in the face. Colbert had just reduced decades of nuanced, powerful performances to a racist stereotype, and he'd done it with a smile on his face. Denzel's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the armrest of his chair, slowly formed fists. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but filled with righteous anger. "Excuse me? Oh, come on," Colbert continued, apparently oblivious to the gravity of what he'd just said. "I'm just saying, you've got a type, the angry black guy who's really good with violence. It's your brand, isn't it?" The audience began to murmur uncomfortably. Some people were already shaking their heads in disbelief. This wasn't comedy. This wasn't clever interviewing. This was just pure disrespect, wrapped in a thin veneer of humor. Denzel leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Colbert's face. "Stephen, I think you need to be very careful about what you're saying right now." But Colbert was on a roll, drunk on his own perceived cleverness. "I mean, let's be honest here. Hollywood loves to put you in these roles because it sells tickets to a certain demographic, right? The whole angry black man thing really resonates with audiences who want to see that stereotype confirmed." That was it. That was the moment Stephen Colbert crossed a line that should never be crossed. He had just accused one of the most respected actors in history of perpetuating harmful stereotypes for profit, and he'd done it in the most insulting way possible. Denzel stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the seated host. The camera operators scrambled to keep both men in frame, as the tension in the studio became almost unbearable. "Let me tell you something, Stephen," Denzel said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, struggle, and achievement. "I have spent my entire career trying to bring dignity, complexity, and truth to every role I've played. I've portrayed presidents, coaches, soldiers, fathers, and yes, men who have had to fight for what's right. But to sit here and reduce all of that to some kind of stereotype shows exactly who you are as a person." Colbert's face went pale as Denzel's words hit him like a freight train. But instead of backing down, instead of apologizing for his disgusting comments, the host doubled down. His ego wouldn't let him admit he was wrong, even as he stared up at one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. "Oh, come on, Denzel," Colbert said with a nervous laugh, trying to wave off the gravity of the situation. "You're being way too sensitive here. I'm just making an observation about your filmography. It's not that deep." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was Stephen Colbert, a privileged comedian who had never faced a day of real struggle in his life, telling Denzel Washington that he was being too sensitive about racism. The studio audience began to boo, actually boo their own host, something that had never happened in the show's history. Denzel's eyes flashed with an intensity that could have melted steel. "Sensitive? You think I'm being sensitive?" His voice rose slightly, not shouting, but carrying a power that made every person in that studio feel the weight of his words. "Let me educate you about sensitivity, Stephen. Sensitivity is what you should have had before you opened your mouth." "Look, I'm sorry if you took it the wrong way," Colbert said, but his apology was hollow, condescending. "But we're just having a conversation here. This is what talk shows are for, right? A little back and forth?" "A little back and forth," Denzel repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you call reducing my life's work to a racist caricature? Is that your idea of conversation?" The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this unprecedented confrontation. The production assistants were frantically signaling to each other, unsure whether to cut to commercial or keep filming this historic meltdown. The audience was completely silent now, watching in stunned amazement as their beloved late-night host revealed his true colors. Colbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally beginning to realize that he had made a catastrophic mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "I think you're overreacting here, Denzel. I mean, I've had plenty of black guests on this show, and they've never had a problem with my questions." That comment made everything worse. Denzel's expression shifted from anger to something even more dangerous, complete contempt. "Oh, you've had black guests before? Well then, that makes everything okay, doesn't it? That's your defense?" "I'm just saying," Colbert stammered, now visibly sweating under the studio lights. "Maybe you're reading too much into this. Maybe this is about something else entirely. Maybe you're having a bad day or something." The sheer stupidity of that comment hung in the air like poison gas. Colbert had just suggested that Denzel Washington's reaction to blatant racism was simply because he was having a bad day. The audience gasped audibly. Several people actually stood up and started walking toward the exits. Denzel took a step closer to Colbert's desk, his presence filling the entire studio. "A bad day? You think this is about me having a bad day?" His voice was quiet now, but that made it even more terrifying. "Stephen, let me tell you about bad days. A bad day is when someone like you, sitting behind a desk with a platform that reaches millions of people, decides to use that platform to spread ignorance and hate." "Hate? Now hold on," Colbert protested weakly, his voice cracking slightly. "I never said anything hateful. I was just making a point about your career choices." "Your point?" Denzel laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the laugh of a man who had heard this type of ignorance one too many times. "Your point was to reduce everything I've worked for, everything I've accomplished, to some kind of minstrel show for your amusement. That was your point." The host was squirming now, looking around desperately for support from his production team, but finding none. Even his own crew was staring at him with disgust and disappointment. The man they had worked with for years had just revealed himself to be everything they thought he wasn't. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," Colbert said, trying to regain control of the situation. "Why don't we start over? I'll ask you about your new movie, and we can just pretend this conversation never happened." Pretend it never happened. Those words sealed Colbert's fate completely. He wanted to sweep his racism under the rug, to continue with business as usual after insulting one of the most respected men in America on national television. Denzel shook his head slowly, a sad smile crossing his face. "Pretend it never happened? That's your solution? Just ignore the fact that you sat here and disrespected not just me, but every actor who looks like me who has ever tried to bring dignity to their craft. I think you're blowing this way out of proportion, Colbert said desperately. Can't we just agree to disagree and move on? Agree to disagree? Denzel's voice was incredulous. There's nothing to disagree about here, Stephen. You said what you said. You meant what you meant. And now you want me to sit here and pretend like it's just a difference of opinion? The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every eye was on these two men, watching as years of built-up frustration and injustice poured out of one of Hollywood's most dignified stars. This wasn't just about Denzel anymore. This was about every actor of color who had ever been reduced to a stereotype, every person who had ever been told they were overreacting to racism, every individual who had been asked to just get over it and move on. Colbert made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Denzel, I respect you tremendously. You're a great actor and a great man. Can't we just chalk this up to a misunderstanding? Denzel looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. A misunderstanding? No, Stephen, I understand perfectly. I understand exactly who you are and what you think of people like me. The only misunderstanding here was mine, thinking that you might actually be different from all the others. The weight of those words hit Colbert like a physical blow. He had spent years building his reputation as a progressive voice, someone who stood up for marginalized communities. But in just a few minutes, he had destroyed all of that with his own ignorance and arrogance. Colbert sat frozen in his chair, the color completely drained from his face as the full impact of his career-ending mistake began to sink in. But even now, even as his world crumbled around him, his ego refused to let him take responsibility for what he had done. Denzel, please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think there's been a huge miscommunication here. I never meant to offend you or anyone else. Maybe if you just sit back down, we can work this out. Work this out. As if decades of systemic racism and stereotyping could be worked out with a few more minutes of conversation. As if the damage hadn't already been done in front of millions of viewers. Denzel looked down at this pathetic man and felt something he rarely experienced, complete and utter contempt. Work this out? Denzel's voice was steady, controlled, but every word carried the force of a hurricane. Stephen, the only thing that needs to be worked out is how you're going to explain to your audience, your network, and your family why you thought it was acceptable to sit here and reveal your true feelings about black actors on national television. The audience began to murmur again, this time with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Many of them had been fans of Colbert for years, believing him to be an ally, a progressive voice in late-night television. Now they were seeing him for what he really was, and the disappointment was palpable. But I am an ally, Colbert protested weakly, as if he could read their thoughts. I've supported civil rights causes. I've donated money to organizations. I've had important conversations about race on this show. Denzel's laugh was cold and bitter. You've had conversations about race? With who, Stephen? With other white people who pat you on the back for being so enlightened? Because clearly, when you're faced with an actual black person who won't play along with your stereotypes, this is how you really feel. The truth of those words hit everyone in the studio like a slap in the face. All of Colbert's supposed allyship, all of his progressive posturing, had been nothing more than performance art. When it really mattered, when he was face to face with one of the most accomplished black men in America, his true colors had shone through completely. That's not fair, Colbert said, his voice cracking with desperation. You don't know what's in my heart? You don't know how I really feel about these issues? Denzel stepped even closer to the desk, his towering presence making Colbert look even smaller and more pathetic than before. I don't need to know what's in your heart, Stephen. I know what came out of your mouth. And what came out of your mouth told me everything I need to know about who you really are. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. Every person in that room, from the audience members to the production crew, was witnessing something unprecedented in television history. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a complete and total exposure of everything fake and hollow about modern media. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to save himself. Denzel, I'm begging you. I made a mistake. I said some things I shouldn't have said. But can't we talk about this like reasonable people? Can't you find it in your heart to forgive me? The audacity was breathtaking. After insulting Denzel's entire career and reducing his life's work to racist stereotypes, Colbert was now asking for forgiveness, not offering a real apology, not taking responsibility for his words, but asking his victim to absolve him of his sins. Denzel stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and absolutely devastating. Stephen, I want you to listen to me very carefully because this might be the most important thing you ever hear in your life. Forgiveness is not something you ask for. Forgiveness is something you earn through genuine remorse, real change, and consistent action over time. But you're not asking for forgiveness. You're asking me to make you feel better about the terrible things you just said. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but Denzel held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished, Denzel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. You want to know what's really sad about this whole situation? It's that millions of people watch this show every night because they believe you care about them, because they think you're fighting for justice and equality. But tonight, you've shown them and the entire world that when push comes to shove, you're just another privileged man who sees people like me as nothing more than entertainment. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for Colbert's career. Several audience members were openly crying now, not just from the emotional weight of Denzel's speech, but from the crushing disappointment of seeing someone they had trusted reveal himself to be a fraud. I've spent 40 years in this business, Denzel said, his voice growing quieter but more intense. 40 years fighting to be seen as more than just a stereotype, more than just an angry black man with a gun. I've played kings and presidents, teachers and fathers, heroes and villains, all with the hope that maybe, just maybe, the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles I've fought. But sitting here tonight, listening to you reduce all of that work to nothing more than a marketing strategy, I realized that we still have so much further to go. Colbert was visibly shaking now, understanding that he had not just insulted Denzel Washington, but had attacked the very foundation of everything the man had worked for his entire life. The magnitude of his mistake was finally beginning to register, but it was far too late to take any of it back. Denzel straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera, addressing the millions of viewers watching at home. To everyone watching tonight, I want you to remember something. Dignity is not negotiable. Respect is not optional. And when someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. He turned back to Colbert one final time, his voice carrying the weight of generations of struggle and perseverance. Stephen, I hope that someday you'll understand the damage you've done tonight. Not just to me, but to every person who believed in you. But that understanding will have to come from within, because I'm done trying to educate people who don't want to learn. With those final crushing words, Denzel Washington turned and walked off the stage with the same dignity and grace he had brought to every role, every interview, and every moment of his remarkable career. The audience erupted in applause. Not the polite golf clap of a typical talk show, but a thunderous standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Stephen Colbert sat alone at his desk, staring at the empty chair where one of Hollywood's greatest legends had just delivered the most devastating takedown in television history. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his humiliation, every moment of his complete and total destruction. The show that was supposed to be a celebration of cinema had become a funeral for a career built on lies and false personas. And as the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out in stunned silence, everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for decades to come. The night Stephen Colbert learned that respect cannot be faked, dignity cannot be bought, and some lines should never, ever be crossed.